Yeah, thank you, Massimo, for this kind introduction, and thank you for this wonderful invitation. Someone has to be the last one in a conference, and but being the last one means one can more or less only repeat what others have said, and I hope that at least some new ideas will come up in my presentation so that you get not bored too much. Let me start with an anachronistic dialogue. So here's one quite early cosmopolitan, Erasmus von Rotterdam. He wrote in a letter to Ulrich Zwingli in 1522, I want to become a citizen of the world. And not only I want to become, I'm longing for it. He's really longing for it. And now imagine that he says this to, and therefore anachronistic, to Theresa May. And here's her answer. If you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what citizenship means. I could, of course, think about a kind of intellectual asymmetry between Erasmus von Rotterdam and Theresa May, but if we take these two sentences seriously, one could ask who will be right. And I would like to try to give an answer, and while giving an answer, referring to some problems of citizenship. But first of all, I would like to argue with some, I guess, background assumptions of Theresa May's answer, which are that to be a citizen means to belong to a nation. And belonging to a nation seems to mean something what we call in German Heimat or something like that. So you are a member of a substantial pre-political community, and citizenship, often mediated by a constitution, expresses a nation's identity, and you are part of that identity. So I think that much of the debate about migration and the consequences of that debate, which we are facing now in Europe, the renaissance of nationalism and ethno-nationalism, has at its background this idea of nation as something substantial. And this is often proposed to the artificial constitutional framework of a state. And I think that this confrontation or this opposition is wrong already for the understanding of a nation. So that's my first part. So here's why I think that if one presupposes that in the background of Theresa May's answer lies this assumption of the nation as a substance pre-political and pre-legal, that this is wrong, at least for modern times. So I go back to the French Revolution and to Abbé Sieyès, who in his famous book, What is the Third Estate, in 1798, asked the question rhetorically, of course, what is a nation? And here's his answer. His answer is quite short and concise. It is a body of associates living under a common law and represented by the same legislature. And then come some other issues. So that's an interesting answer. A body of associates living under a common law and represented by the same legislature. So there's no connotation of something substantial, pre-political or pre-legal properties of a society or something like that. It's something like a legal definition. That's a nation. This is, of course, then mirrored in the French Revolution itself. So the famous night of the 4th to the 5th of August in 1789, when the Comte de Noailles proposed to abolish all feudal privileges, which is admirable for the Comte, because the Comte belonged to the ruling class of the noblemen. So he voted for that, and there was a vote to abolish these privileges. And according to the interpretation of François Furet, a famous French historian, this was a precondition for becoming a nation, because abolishing all these feudal privileges meant abolishing hierarchy and status and estate differences. Only then there is an association of free and equal individuals who associate without any differences in status and hierarchy and so on. And this equal liberty is a precondition for coming together to form a nation. So quite analogous to Abésière's idea that a nation is an association of individuals, free and equal individuals, under a common law. And under a common law means, of course, a general law for free and equal individuals. If one tries to look back and to look for some roots for Abésière's non-substantial or non-essentialist interpretation of the nation, one can find a similar distinction already in Cicero in one of his 2 books on the state or the republic, where Cicero distinguishes between 2 homelands. Every man has 2 homelands, he says, duas patrias. The one is the local homeland. That's where I am born, where I grew up, where I share some conventions and traditions. And the other one is the legal homeland. Of course, this was Rome. And he coins 2 expressions for that. The one is the patria naturae. That's my natural home. And the other is the patria civitatis, or he also calls it patria iuris. So that's my civic homeland. And that's the republic where I am a cives, or a citizen. But this is distinct from my local homeland. So in a republic, there can live many people together, many individuals together who have different natural homelands. And this was obviously the case in the Roman Empire. But there's one patria iuris, so one republic to which all these natural members of their local homeland live together. And he defines the patria iuris, or the republic, in a similar way as Abésière did. And perhaps Abésière, I mean, all these young French revolutionaries were well educated and knew the Latin, ancient Latin and Greek authors. Perhaps he had Cicero in his mind when he defined the nation. A nation is a multitude of human beings who associate by recognizing a common law for the purpose of a common good. So again, we have human beings who associate and recognize a common law. A similar answer was given by Immanuel Kant, who perhaps already, I just was told some days ago that that Kant read Abésière, that he knew the book on the Third Estate. So Kant defines the state which he calls civitas. So in this tradition of Cicero, Abesies, and so on, a state is the union of a number of men under juridical laws. So he does not speak of association, but of union. Vereinigung, which means less than a union, if one translates it as Einheit or unity, it's just a Vereinigung of men under juridical laws. So what is important with regard to this definition of the nation? And I think what is most important is that this definition reveals that a nation is completely artificial. A nation is not natural. Natural is what Cicero called the patria naturae. That's where I grew up. But there are often many different patriae naturae in a nation or in an association, in a legal association. But the nation itself is an association. So people have to come together and they have to decide. They have intentionally and consciously decide to associate under a common law. And this coincides with the formation of a nation. So there is no nation without a legal association. And the legal association, then, if it is made, is the nation. So according to this tradition, a nation is completely artificial. It's made by men, at least from Cicero to Kant, only by men, but today we would say made by men and women, of course, and not something substantial, which is somehow given or pre-given. But of course, no one could ask the question, where does the authority come from to associate under a common law? And the interesting story is that this question for the legitimate authority to form a nation was given during the French Revolution, some weeks later, after the night of the famous night of the 4th to the 5th of August, by on August 26th, by the Declaration of Human Rights. So, or correctly, of human rights and the rights of citizens. So first, it's interesting that human rights and rights of citizens are given in one and the same declaration. But in Article 2, it is said that the purpose of each political association is the protection and of natural rights and rights of men. So that's the purpose why there is a political association or a nation. And it means that the authority to give a constitution and to form a nation comes from the human rights, because the human rights empower people to associate, because only when they associate, human rights can be preserved and protected and realized on different territories. So one important consequence of this reconstruction is that human beings are always, according to this view, citizens of two worlds. So if human beings, if individuals come together to associate, to found a legal association or a nation, they always understand themselves at the same time as citizens of two worlds. So first as human beings, as the addressees and authors of human rights. And as such, they associate, or they found a cosmopolitan or human rights association. And then they associate under a common law in a specific historical and social context to have a constitution and to build a nation in order to, but the link between these two is that they have to realize the human rights which belong to their cosmopolitan association with the constitution of a nation, which always means they associate under specific historical and economic and social conditions. And this is also necessary in order to realize human rights, because human rights cannot be realized everywhere at the same time, under the same circumstances and conditions. In order to realize human rights, what is part of the empowerment to give a constitution, you have to do it with regard to the historical and social and so on differences on different territories. So that's the reason why there are legal associations or nations with their constitutions in order to realize human rights. If one tries to play a little bit more with this distinction between the two worlds, the cosmopolitan association and the legal association or political association, one could say that while giving a constitution, the citizens of the two worlds encounter each other in their dual role. So as associated human rights subjects and as citizens of a nation. And giving a constitution means to communicate with each other and with themselves in this dual role. So they have to be aware that when they give a constitution, that it has to be a constitution realizing human rights. And they interpret the human rights with regard to the specific conditions and historical circumstances under which they give themselves a constitution. So it's an, let's say, an internal dialogue between their two roles. So if I draw a conclusion out of this historical, idealistic, utopian reconstruction of at least some of the intentions and good ideas of the French Revolution, one could resume and say, what is a nation? So it's artificial and not substantial. It is intrinsically juridical. A nation is necessary in order to have someone to which one can attribute the task to realize human rights. It is a community with inclusive civic equality, equal rights, and on a demarcated territory of a population. And its main purpose is the conservation of the natural rights of man, as it was declared in Article 2 of the Revolutionary Declaration of Human Rights and Rights of Citizens. So one could say, well, the Cosmopolitan Association of Human Rights is first, the Constitution is second, and the nation is third. Or could also say Cosmopolitan Association first, and Constitution and nation in one and the same moment, co-original. And yeah, why are constitutions important? What is a nation? Second step, it's the normative and legal community, of course with a border, which then also, I come back to that later, distinguishing between citizens and foreigners, between in and out. But within the community, there has to be equality of all citizens under the national constitutions. And of course, equal political participation. That's one of the consequences. Stefan Kirste pointed that out. If you have free and equal legal persons, self-determination comes with it. And of course, this meant, historically, this meant also that what Habermas once called the administrative penetration of individuals. So they all become subject to the same law, to the same legally founded administration. And of course, this was one of the possibility or the conditions for the mobilization of masses, as we saw for the first time in the revolutionary wars of France in the end of the 18th century. So constitutions then are nothing else than the concrete positive legal form which is created by the associated individuals, and constitutions design the particular way to realize human rights under specific historical and so on context, conditions, and circumstances. So now, what are the consequences of such a view on nations? What is with the history and identity of a nation, which is, of course, important today in the debates about migration and national identity. And what I would like to presuppose is that from the point of view I tried to develop with this tradition from Cicero to Arbisiez and Kant and the French Revolution, one should have a different view on national identity. National identity, as I said in the beginning, referring to Theresa May and her possible pre-understandings, often associated with substantial natural features and qualities of a community, and so on and so on. And often, and also that might be behind Theresa May's answer to Erasmus von Rotterdam, is that otherwise you cannot have a national identity. And I would like to show that there can be a national identity, even in this republican tradition of a nation. But this national identity has to be explained and in a different way. It has a different normative meaning than that what is usually called national identity. So if a nation has the task and the purpose to preserve and to develop human rights on a specific territory and specific conditions, then national history has to be understood as a history of the experiences of constituted people with their fights for a realization of human rights. So the people have developed their historical identity when they look back to their history, not we as Deutsche and so on, but we as Germans or French or Estonians look back to our history of fighting for the realization of human rights on our territory, because that's what the purpose of the whole nation is. And that's our history, the history we would like to keep in our memory and which are part of our national identity. National history has to be conceived as a fight for the infinite realization of human rights. And each national constitution then represents this national history of this fight, and of course the level which was reached when they fought for the realization of human rights under their particular circumstances. And that's what could be the national identity, so that citizens identify with the human rights level of their constitution, what they have reached in their historical fights for human rights on their territory. And if you look at the historical development of democracies with a constitution, this is an important part. These were the big fights we fought for in order to have political equality, equal rights for women, rights for workers, and so on and so on. So these are all fights for the realization of human rights on their specific circumstances. So what is revealed by this kind of national identity is that citizens with this understanding take something like a critical reflective attitude to their own constitution. So they view their constitution and the development of their constitution from the point of view of the association of human rights and the realization of human rights during their history. And that's what one can call this positive identification with the human rights level of their constitution. One could call it Verfassungspatriotismus. So that's, of course, the other important, and now I come back to citizenship, is the question, what does it mean for citizenship from this point of view? So citizenship then is, of course, a legal status. It means to become an equal member of a legal association of a nation. And what is important here is to see that to become a member of a legal association is different from becoming a member of a substantially defined community. First of all, you are become a member of a legal association. So the individual becomes a legal subject with equal access to constitutional rights. So one of the most quoted sentences on this conference, of course, was the one of Hannah Arendt, another interpretation of the right to have rights. So citizenship is, one could call, the mirror and the concrete form of the status as a human rights subject in a national constitution. So if I am a citizen of a legal association or a nation, I don't lose my status as a citizen of the Cosmopolitan Association, but the citizenship is as the constitution concretizes human rights on a certain territory, citizenship concretizes my status as a citizen of the Cosmopolitan Association. And of course, then this means also it entails some fundamental individual rights, which I have as basic rights as a citizen under a constitution. So what does that mean for people on the move? And after having learned so much on this conference, I would have written this slide differently now. So this is the former version. But I think what is important to see is that from a cosmopolitan and human rights view, the human rights subject is entitled to and has a claim to become a citizen. Another meaning of the right to have rights, and we have discussed about the difficult questions yesterday, whether this is a moral right or legal right, and what does it entail and what does it not entail. But I think what is important from a purely cosmopolitan point of view is that it is completely contingent where I shall become a citizen. As long as the legal association of which I become a member has the purpose to realize human rights and pursues this aim. So if I only look on myself as a cosmopolitan, it's completely contingent in which legal association I shall enter, as long as these associations have the purpose to realize human rights. So the difficult question then comes, what happens if a nation violates human rights? And of course then, from a cosmopolitan point of view, citizens have a right to fight against it, against the violation. And if not, and that's the sentence where I'm now doubting, whether they have a right to move to a nation which protects human rights and pursues the aim of their realization. So if the fight against violation of human rights fails, whether they have a right to move into another nation, because from a cosmopolitan point of view, it's completely contingent to which legal association I belong. And of course, there is a massive inequality in the levels of human rights realization among nations, so what makes citizenship become a birthright lottery, as Ayelet Shachar called it. But now one has to add the opposite view, the view from the point of view of a citizen who is citizen of a nation and and participates in its national identity and history. Because from this point of view, I have a certain right to protect and defend the level of human rights realization which I have reached together with my co-citizens in a long struggle and fight for the realization of human rights within my nation. So this stands in opposition to this cosmopolitan view that it doesn't matter to which legal association you belong. As a member of a national legal association, I have an interest, and I would call it a legitimate interest to keep and to preserve the level of human rights which we have reached together on this national territory. So the question would be, what would be the consequences if I enact the dialogue between myself as a citizen of the Cosmopolitan Association and as a citizen of my national legal association? And I would say at least the consequence would be that I have perhaps not to let everybody in, but that I have to legislate on migration from the point of view of both roles, and not only from the role of myself as a citizen of the National Legal Association. And other consequences would be that I have to argue for international cooperation to minimize inequality and perhaps also to redistribute wealth between different nations, as Ayelet Shachar has suggested. So, in the end, just the opposite narrative, just to remind you. And of course, the question is, if one has this completely utopian, likely crazy reconstruction of Republican legal associations, why could the opposite narrative become so strong? And of course, there are many contingent and historical reasons. According to this narrative, of course, the nation comes first, the constitution second. Human rights are primarily an external limitation of national sovereignty. So national sovereignty means you can, as a sovereign, can do what you want in legislation, but there are some external limits which you may not violate, and this is the primary negative function of human rights. But human rights are not understood as internal purposes of a legal association or a nation. So that's a huge difference. And of course, the Constitution is considered as a manifestation or articulation of the particular substance of a nation, like language, history, tradition, ethnicity. And this, of course, refers to Herder's quite innocent apolitical idea of a folk, which has a creative power, which manifests primarily in language and something like a Volksgeist, a natural, a part of human nature, which is set in opposition to the mechanical and artificial state. There you already have this opposition between patria naturae and patria civitatis. So there's this natural patria, and the state is something artificial and mechanically, and therefore something suspect. And if you, for example, look at ethno-nationalist publications today, you find this opposition again. And in particular in France, Marine Le Pen and others, they refer to a similar distinction, pays réel and pays légal. Pays réel is the real pays, where we live together and have our common traditions, and the pays légal is this artificial thing there in Paris, where the elites do what they want. And so if you conceive of this opposition in this way, you can imagine what the consequences are. And of course, it's obvious that the consequences for citizenship, for the concept of citizenship in the tradition of this narrative, is that citizenship has to do something with substantial identity of a community, and that you may not, that you have to become, if you want to become a member, you have to learn the language, and you have to internalize the traditions, and so on and so on. So just finally, just to remind you and to confront again what is a cosmopolis. I was talking about citizens of a cosmopolitan association. Of course, a cosmopolis is not a sovereign state. It's probably a moral association of human rights subjects, always in transition to a legal association. There is no central legislator who can define the content of human rights, and one has, of course, take into account the dark history of the realization of human rights, colonialism, civilisation, mission civilisatrice, and so on and so on. But also the history of the realization of human rights. And there are also already some international courts which are stepping into the direction to make a cosmopolis also into a legal association. For example, the International Criminal Law, Court of Criminal Law would be one of the examples. So citizen of nowhere, yes and no. So there will never be a cosmopolis as a sovereign state. There will only be constitutional nation states or cooperations among them, like the European Union. But what is important, that they adopt or re-adopt the cosmopolitan self-understanding. So cosmopolitans are citizens of a nation state taking a critical reflective attitude to their national constitution. So in the end, back to Erasmus von Rotterdam. So what is a cosmopolitan? How could one give Erasmus von Rotterdam's answer a different meaning or a different interpretation? The word kupio is interesting, longing for it, never reaching it. So it could mean that kupio means always in transition. So a cosmopolitan is a citizen in transitu, who is at the same time and always on the way to become a cosmopolis. And so a cosmopolitan is the one who is always on the move and will never come to the end. Thank you.